This is the story of a father who abandons the cycle of caring for and pampering his ungrateful son, leaving him in the lurch. The final gift, he believes, will teach him how to face consequences and grow up. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. You really think he'll be surprised? I whispered to myself, shifting the weight of the cake in my left hand as I balanced a small velvet box under my arm. It was early evening, the kind of April light that turned everything gold and made even the shadows stretch long and soft. I stood just inside the kitchen staring at the back door that opened onto the yard, where laughter floated in careless and sharp. The chocolate cake wobbled dangerously as I adjusted my grip. I'd baked it myself, something I hadn't done in years. I'd piped Happy 29th Ryan in neat white frosting, each letter painstakingly shaped, even though my hands shook with nerves. In the small velvet box rested something far more important, an antique gold watch that had belonged to my father. It was one of the few heirlooms he had left me, a piece that had ticked steadily for more than 50 years. I had it cleaned, fitted with a new leather band, and polished until it gleamed. I imagined Ryan slipping it on one day before a job interview or even his wedding. Something meaningful, something that said more than words ever could. For weeks I had waited for this moment. His birthday was my chance to remind him that no matter how tense things had been lately, I was still his father. The kitchen was set like a stage. The dining table neatly arranged with the plates I had picked out that morning, silverware polished roast, cooling on the stove wine glasses waiting to be filled. It was supposed to be a family dinner, the kind of tradition that had once mattered. Through the glass door, I caught pieces of conversation. Kyle's voice rang loud and careless. "Man, your dad really went all out. Look at all this top-shelf beer sound system, even a catering spread." Ryan's reply came with a smoothness I had heard too often, lately dismissive and cutting. "Yeah, well, he's just trying to buy my affection. He thinks money fixes everything." The words hit me harder than I expected. I gripped the cake plate so tightly the cardboard flexed. My throat closed, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then Derek chimed in, trying to defend me. "At least he cares. My old man barely calls." Ryan didn't miss a beat. "I'm tired of him breathing down my neck about getting a job, moving out, taking responsibility. He just doesn't get how hard it is right now." I froze, rooted to the spot, the cool metal of the door handle pressing against my fingers. My son stood outside a beer bottle, glinting in the last rays of sunlight, gesturing casually as he dismantled everything I had done for him across nearly 3 decades. And then the line came, the one that cleaved my world in two. "Honestly, the best gift he could give me is to disappear from my life forever." The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and careless. Kyle chuckled. Derek smirked. Melissa glanced up from her phone just long enough to roll her eyes. They didn't realize that the man they were mocking stood only feet away, cake and heirloom in hand. I steadied myself, careful not to let the cake slip, careful not to make a sound. Slowly, I stepped back into the kitchen, setting the cake and the watch down on the counter. The roast filled the air with a savory smell, but it might as well have been ashes. The dining table I had so carefully set looked like a showroom display, perfect, but hollow, not meant for us. I leaned against the counter, listening to my son outside, his voice louder than the rest, carrying over the laughter, like he was the king of something he hadn't built. He joked about how I had embarrassed him at a car dealership last year. More laughter rose. I thought about all the birthdays past, the candles lit, the baseball games, the nights I stayed up helping him with homework, the hospital visits, even the bail money I had once scraped together without telling his mother. Every sacrifice reduced to a joke, I sat down at the dining table, staring at the velvet box. My father's words echoed in my mind. A man's time is the only thing he can't buy back. Spend it on what matters. For almost 30 years I had spent my time on Ryan, and in that moment he wanted me gone. The laughter outside grew louder, careless, and cruel, but inside me something shifted. It wasn't rage, not even sadness. It was clarity, cold and steady like a gear locking into place. I didn't storm out. I didn't yell. Instead, I sat in the dark kitchen watching my reflection in the glass door, listening to the party outside that I had paid for in the house I had built on the deck I had stained with my own hands. And for the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I glanced at the clock, 6:42 p.m. An hour from now, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers would wash across the yard, and nothing would ever be the same. But at that moment, cake untouched, watch unopened, I understood something vital. My son had given me his wish, and soon I was going to grant it. I didn't even remember climbing the stairs, but somehow I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, elbows balanced on my knees, staring at the dresser where I'd placed the cake and the velvet box. The voices from the backyard drifted faintly through the walls, laughter, clinking bottles, music thumping softly from the speakers I had wired last summer. All of it sounded distant, as though it belonged to a life I was no longer a part of. The watch caught the glow of the bedside lamp, its face worn smooth from decades of use, the leather strap supple from careful handling. My father had worn it every day until the end. I could still see him at the kitchen table of my childhood home, winding it each Sunday with ritual precision. A man's time, he would say, is the only thing he can't buy back. Spend it wisely. Those words echoed in me now louder than the laughter downstairs. I'd spent nearly 30 years pouring time into Ryan's life shelter food tuition and countless second chances. Every time he stumbled, I was there to lift him up. I convinced myself it was what fathers did. But as I sat in the quiet bedroom, I began to realize I hadn't just given him support. I'd given him permission to lean, permission to drift, permission never to stand on his own. I thought back to nights spent at the kitchen table, bills spread out like a battlefield, and how often I'd chosen to pay his rent instead of fixing the car I drove to work. I remembered pawning my fishing gear one summer just to cover his tuition balance. And of course the night I bailed him out after a bar fight gone wrong, something we swore his mother would never know. Every sacrifice had been justified, in my mind, as love. But was it? Or had it simply been fear? Fear that he'd fail if I didn't protect him. Fear that if I withheld support, he would cut me off altogether. I couldn't deny the truth anymore. My generosity had become his crutch, and he'd grown comfortable dragging it around rather than walking on his own. The truth burned, but it was also clarifying. Ryan's words on the patio. The best gift he could give me is to disappear from my life, forever, had landed like a blow, yet in a twisted way they had freed me. For years I had wrestled with the question of when to stop, when to say enough. And tonight my son had answered it for me. The laughter outside rose again, sharp and cruel, and I pictured him holding quart of beer in one hand, flipping burgers with the other, as if he owned the place. I pictured his friends, Kyle leaning back, Derek smirking, Melissa scrolling absently on her phone, all of them standing on a deck I had built with my hands, eating food I had paid for drinking from my fridge. And not one of them felt the slightest discomfort as Ryan mocked me. I caught my reflection in the glass of the bedroom window. The man staring back looked older, sterner than I remembered. Lines carved into his face, not just by years, but by disappointment. His jaw was tight, his eyes harder than they had ever been. That's when I understood I was no longer just a father. I was a man reclaiming his ground. Downstairs, the roast sat untouched, the table perfectly set for a dinner no one would eat. The house I had worked 35 years to pay off now felt like a museum of effort, walls and furniture, whispering of time-spent sacrifices, made promises kept. And my son wanted me erased from it. I stood and paced the room, my footsteps muffled against the carpet. The watch glimmered on the dresser, and I picked it up, weighing it in my palm. Heavy, solid, steady everything my son was not. I set it back down carefully, almost ceremoniously. I glanced at the clock again, 7:05 p.m. In less than an hour, the flashing lights of police cruisers would pull into my driveway, and this house would no longer echo with my son's laughter. It would echo with silence. And maybe that silence would finally tell the truth. I had been avoiding Ryan, didn't need more of my money. He didn't need more of my time. He needed the weight of consequence. The voices outside swelled again, but they no longer pierced me. Instead, I felt a calm spread through me, cold and deliberate. A decision had been made. I had given him years of birthdays, years of chances, years of unconditional love. Now I was about to give him the only gift left worth giving, the gift of my absence. The house had grown impossibly still, the kind of silence that magnifies every sound, the tick of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint creak of the banister when I placed my hand on it. I moved slowly down the stairs, each step blending with the muffled thump of bass from the backyard speakers. The roast sat untouched on the stove, the dining table still set like a display in a store window, waiting for a dinner that would never happen. Through the sliding glass door, I saw him. Ryan stood at the grill spatula in one hand, beer in the other, laughing too hard at something Kyle had just said. Derek was perched on the railing like it was a bar stool boots, scraping the paint I'd applied with my own hands. Melissa sat with her phone, half listening, half posting, always performing. I opened the door. The sound of the party rushed in, laughter, smoke, the sharp scent of beer, and for a moment every head turned toward me. Ryan barely glanced over his shoulder, then back to his friends. "Ryan," I said, steady but firm. "Can we talk privately?" He smirked, still tending the grill. "If it's about the burgers, I got it under control. It's not about the burgers." Now the others shifted glances, darting. Melissa looked up, curious. Kyle took a slow sip of his drink, settling in to watch. Ryan set the spatula down, turned toward me with an exaggerated sigh, and crossed his arms. "Whatever you've got to say, Dad, say it here. We're all friends." I studied him, the relaxed stance, the smug tilt of his head, the faint flush from too many beers. He was staging a performance, making me the unwilling actor. "All right," I said, voice lower, sharper. "I heard what you said earlier." His expression didn't flicker. "And I want to know if you meant it." The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of grease on the grill. Then Ryan met my eyes, cold and flat. "Yeah, I meant it. You hover, you micromanage, you make everything about your expectations. I'm almost 30 years old, I don't need you running my life." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Kyle smirked. Derek leaned forward. Melissa finally set her phone down. Every word my son spoke was another cut, sharp-edged, deliberate. I kept my voice even. "You live in my house. You eat my food. You drive my car. You use my electricity and my internet. And you want me gone." He shrugged casual, as if brushing lint from his sleeve. "I didn't ask you for any of that. You chose to give it. That's on you. It was like staring at a stranger who happened to wear my son's face. The same jawline, the same eyes, but no trace of the boy I'd raised." Kyle clapped him on the shoulder. "He's got a point, Mr. Miller," Kyle said, smirking. "Parents choose to have kids. You don't get a medal for feeding them." The heat rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Feeding a child is one thing. Paying for their entire life at 29 is another. Ryan smirked, lips thin. "I'm sure you'll get over it. And when you finally do disappear, I'll miss the free rent for maybe a week. Then I'll figure something out." Melissa laughed softly, tilting her head. "You're terrible," she teased, but her smile was indulgent, charmed by his bravado. I looked at each of them, my son, his friends, his girlfriend, all standing on the deck I had built, drinking the beer I had bought, using the sound system I had installed. Not one looked remotely uncomfortable with what he had just said. The moment crystallized in me. This wasn't about one bad night. This was who Ryan had chosen to become. The music thumped softly behind us, but even the speakers seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for me to break. I could feel every eye on me, waiting for me to shout, to snap, to create a scene they'd recount later as a funny story. Instead, I stepped closer to my son, held his gaze, and said quietly, "You want me gone? Be careful what you wish for." And then, without another word, I turned, slid the glass door shut behind me, and walked back into the house. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed again, staring at the watch on the dresser. My father's words echoed like a verdict. A man's time is the only thing he can't buy back. I had spent nearly 30 years trying to buy Ryan's affection with time, money, sacrifice. Tonight he had made it clear none of it mattered. But what mattered now was me finally listening. The next move would be mine. I didn't storm or slam a door. I didn't even raise my voice. When I walked back into the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence like a metronome, steadying me as I reached for the phone on the counter. My hand didn't shake. My breathing was calm. The decision had already been made the moment Ryan confirmed his words in front of his friends. I dialed, and when the dispatcher answered, my voice came out quiet but firm. "Ma'am, I'd like to report trespassers on my property. My son and his guests are refusing to leave." The words felt strange in my mouth. My son and trespassers in the same sentence, but they were true. Truth didn't require comfort. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. Were they violent? Did I feel unsafe? No, I answered just tired. Tired of being ignored in my own home. She told me officers would be dispatched. I thanked her, hung up, and set the phone down gently on the counter, as though it were porcelain that might break. The kitchen looked staged, the roast cooling untouched on the stove, the untouched plates waiting on the table. I ran a hand across the polished wood, felt the grooves I had sanded myself, the surface I'd set 1,000 meals upon. Tonight, it would stay empty. Tonight, it was a stage for a different kind of performance, one where I would no longer be the silent provider. I glanced at the clock. 7:43 p.m. Right on schedule, red and blue lights painted the siding outside, flashing across the glass like storm waves. The rumble of 2 cruisers in the driveway made the laughter outside falter, then stumble into silence. A knock at the front door. I opened it to 2 officers, their expressions professional, their presence calm but immovable. "Evening, sir," one said. "You called about trespassers?" "Yes," I replied, stepping aside. "They're in the backyard." We walked through the house together, their boots soft on the hardwood I had laid plank by plank. The thump of bass from the backyard speakers carried into the kitchen, but when we slid open the door and stepped onto the deck, the music cut mid-beat. Conversations stopped. All eyes turned. Ryan froze, spatula in hand, beer bottle in the other. His expression shifted from confusion to defiance in a heartbeat. "What the hell is this?" "This," I said evenly, "is me granting your birthday wish." The lead officer, Grant, spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the property owner has asked that everyone leave. If you do not, you will be trespassing." Kyle puffed out his chest, stepping forward. "Come on, man, it's his birthday. We're not hurting anyone." Officer Ramirez didn't flinch. "Not the point. You've been asked to leave. That's the law." Ryan's eyes narrowed at me, burning. "You're doing this in front of everyone?" "Yes," I said, voice clear, unwavering. "In front of everyone." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Melissa stood abruptly, muttering about not wanting trouble. She slipped past the officers into the house, her phone clutched tight. Derek followed quickly, and two neighbors I didn't recognize exchanged glances before heading towards the side gate. But Ryan stayed rooted, his jaw clenched. "Enjoy your empty house, old man." Officer Grant's tone never changed. "Your choice. But if you remain, we'll have to escort you out." Finally, Ryan grabbed his jacket, brushing past me with the smell of beer and smoke trailing behind him. His words were a dagger thrown over his shoulder. "You win." But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a boundary finally drawn. Inside, I watched from the living room window as the last of them filed out, the cruiser's lights splashing across the lawn. The yard was littered with plastic cups and paper plates, the grill still smoking. For the first time in years, the house was quiet. And in that silence, I felt something unlock inside me. Not triumph, not relief. Clarity. This wasn't the first step of my plan. It was the middle. The first step had been every moment I'd chosen silence over confrontation, every time I'd looked away from Ryan's choices instead of holding him accountable. Tonight wasn't revenge. It was the end of pretending. I locked the sliding door, turned off the porch light, and went upstairs to where the watch waited on the dresser. My father's words echoed again. A man's time is the only thing he can't buy back. I had wasted too much of mine trying to be more than a bank account in Ryan's eyes. That ended tonight. The house had exhaled into silence after the cruisers pulled away, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was dense, like a fog I could almost touch. I stood at the living room window watching the last glow of red and blue fade into the night. Plastic cups were scattered across the yard, like abandoned evidence paper plates curled in the damp grass. The grill hissed faintly, smoke trailing upward into the dark. For a moment I thought maybe that was the end of it. Maybe Ryan had left with his friends. Maybe I would wake up tomorrow to a house still mine and a silence that would last more than an hour. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge filling the stillness. Then came the pounding. It started as a rattle at the side gate, a dull thud against the fence. Then a sharp, insistent bang on the siding near the front porch. My son's voice no longer smooth, no longer confident, but raw. "Open up!" I walked to the front hall and peered through the peephole. Ryan staggered into view, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. The beer had worn off into something harsher, something desperate. He hammered the door again. "Ryan," I said through the crack when I opened it just an inch, shoulder pressed firmly against the frame. "Go home! This is home!" he shouted, slamming his shoulder into the door. The deadbolt caught the force and transferred it up my arm like a jolt of electricity. His weight pressed again, harder this time. I held my ground. "Not tonight," I said, voice steady. His laugh was hollow. "Call them again. Call your buddies in blue. See if you get the sympathy you want." "Go on. I don't need sympathy," I told him. "I need sleep." He growled and threw himself against the door once more, rattling the lantern his mother had bought years ago. The sound cut through me sharper than his words had. I braced myself, muscles taut, every nerve alive. "Walk away," I told him. I made his name a full sentence. "Ryan. Walk. Away." But he didn't. Instead, he pounded on the siding, then on the window, trying to invent a rhythm, trying to draw back the audience that had already scattered. The house didn't answer. Neither did I. Finally, I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad for a long moment. Memories flickered: the little boy who used to crawl into bed after nightmares, the teenager who once said I was the only one who understood him, the young man who'd hugged me at his mother's funeral so tightly I could barely breathe. But those moments had been swallowed by years of choices. His choices. I dialed. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline. Is he inside the home? No. Is he attempting to force entry? Yes. I've asked him to leave. He refuses. Do you feel unsafe? I hesitated, then told the truth. No. I feel tired. She promised a unit would arrive. I hung up, turned off the hall light, and waited in the dark. Through the window I could see Ryan pacing his hands, clawing through his hair, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. When the cruisers turned onto the street, the yard glowed again with their red and blue wash. Officer Grant stepped out first, moving with the calm precision of a man who'd done this dance too many times. "What is this?" Ryan demanded, voice cracking with a mix of anger and panic. "He's kicking me out of my own house on my birthday." Grant didn't raise his voice. "It's not your house. It's his." I stood behind the door, my voice steady, almost clinical. "You've been asked to leave." "You didn't." Grant looked at me. "Do you want him off the property? I do." He turned back to Ryan, tone still calm. "Your father is asking you to leave. If you refuse, you're trespassing." Ryan spread his arms wide, trying to make the world bigger than the truth. "I live here. I have rights. You had permission," I said. "And I'm withdrawing it. For tonight." Grant nodded slightly as though confirming the boundary I'd drawn. "That's reasonable," he said to Ryan. "Your father is asking you to leave. If you don't, we'll have to take you in." Ryan laughed, sharp and bitter. "Arrest me then. Make the old man's night." And so they did. Grant's hand was practiced steady, guiding Ryan's wrist, turning him smoothly, the cuffs clicking shut with a sound that landed like a verdict. "Ryan Miller," Grant said formally, "you're under arrest for criminal trespassing and failure to comply with a lawful order." Ryan twisted to glare at me as they led him toward the cruiser. "You happy now? You win? I didn't move. It's not about winning, it's about boundaries." He sneered, but the swagger was gone, replaced by something brittle. Grant helped him into the back seat with quiet dignity, lowering his head, as though Ryan were any other man in cuffs, not just a son on his birthday. The door shut with a heavy thud. The cruisers rolled away, their lights fading until the night was still again. I stood on the porch, the cracked lantern at my feet, the smell of beer and smoke clinging to the boards. For a long minute, I didn't move. The house behind me was silent, utterly still, as if waiting for me to claim it again. And in that silence, I felt the truth settle. I hadn't lost a son tonight. I had drawn a line. And lines, I realized, are where rebuilding begins. The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't the kind of quiet that settles after a long day when the house rests with you. This silence was sharp, almost metallic, the kind that makes every small sound feel amplified, each tick of the clock, each groan of the floorboards as I moved through the rooms. I walked from the porch back into the kitchen. The roast sat in its pan, now cold, the sheen of fat hardened along the edges. The dining table was still perfectly set, the plates and glasses catching the dim light like relics in a museum. For hours I had imagined Ryan sitting there, the two of us sharing a meal, maybe even a laugh. But that fantasy had evaporated the moment I overheard him tell his friends that disappearing would be the greatest gift I could give him. I stood at the table, my hand resting on the back of one of the chairs. The wood was worn smooth, polished by years of use, by meals, with family, by conversations that mattered once. Now it looked like a stage set for a play that had closed years ago. The cake still sat on the counter under its clear dome, the words, "Happy 29th," untouched. I thought about blowing out those candles myself alone, but the image was too absurd, too bitter to stomach. Instead, I turned away and walked to the living room. The house felt foreign. Every item in it, a couch, a lamp, a stack of photo albums, had been chosen, bought, maintained by me. But instead of feeling like home, it felt like evidence, evidence of the decades I had poured into building a life not just for myself, but for my son. 30 years of work, sacrifice, and compromise. And in one night I had been told in no uncertain terms that none of it was wanted. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, the same chair I had sat in countless evenings waiting for Ryan to come home, waiting for him to walk through the door with good news or bad news or sometimes nothing at all. Tonight I sat there waiting for nothing. And yet I couldn't stop the memories from flooding in. The first time he rode a bike, me jogging alongside, breathless with pride when he wobbled but didn't fall. His 7th birthday when he'd asked for a baseball glove, and I had saved for weeks to buy the best one I could afford. The day he graduated high school, his mother and I crying in the stands while he waved half-heartedly at us. The time I drove 2 hours in the middle of the night to pick him up from a party gone wrong, his voice cracking with shame as he promised he'd do better. Promises. So many promises. But what good were promises if they never grew into action? The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't about one cruel remark on a birthday. This was about years. Years of enabling, years of excuses, years of me carrying more than my share of the weight, while he shouldered less and less. Tonight was only the moment I finally heard the truth spoken out loud. And maybe it was the moment I finally believed it. I stood again, restless, pacing the floor. My reflection in the darkened window startled me, a man I barely recognized, jaw-tight eyes, narrowed posture, rigid. He looked less like a father mourning a son, and more like a soldier bracing for battle. For years I had defined myself by being Ryan's father. Every decision, every plan, every sacrifice had circled back to him. If he needed help, I provided it. If he fell, I caught him. If he failed, I carried the blame. And somewhere along the line, I had stopped being a man with my own life. I had become a safety net, and nothing more. Tonight, the net snapped. I walked upstairs to my bedroom again. The watch sat on the dresser, gleaming faintly under the lamplight. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the smooth face, and heard my father's voice in my mind once more. A man's time is the only thing he can't buy back. Spend it on what matters. For 30 years, I had spent nearly all of it on Ryan. And now I understood that I could not buy another minute of his respect, no matter how much more I gave. I set the watch back in its box and closed the lid with deliberate care. Then I pulled a thin file folder from the drawer of my desk, property deed tax statements, insurance papers all in my name, tangible proof of what I had built, proof that this was my house, my time, my life. The silence around me no longer felt like punishment. It felt like possibility. Ryan had wanted me to disappear. And for the first time, I was beginning to think that maybe he was right. Not in the way he imagined vanishing in shame, broken and defeated. No, I would disappear in a way that set me free. The house groaned as it settled in the cool of the evening. I sat on the bed file folder open in my lap and let the thought settle in me sharp and steady. This wasn't just the end of a night. It was the beginning of an exit plan. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the fan blades cutting across the plaster in slow rotations. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's face twisted in defiance as the officers cuffed him, his voice sharp with contempt as he shouted that I had won. But the truth was, this wasn't about winning. It was about clarity, about boundaries. By dawn, I was already out of bed, sitting at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen. The table still held the remnants of what should have been a family meal, unused plates, untouched glasses, silverware that would never clink against each other. The cake sat lopsided under its dome frosting, beginning to crack. It all felt staged now, like props left behind after the actors had gone home. I flipped the pad open and wrote one word across the top: plan. For nearly 3 decades, I had lived reactively stepping in whenever Ryan stumbled, fixing whatever fell apart, bailing him out, whether it was Grade's rent or even legal trouble. That approach had done nothing but teach him that failure came with no cost, that consequences could be dodged, because Dad would always make things right. Not anymore. This time I would approach the problem like the engineer I had been all my life, step by step, logically, methodically. Break down what seemed overwhelming into parts I could solve. Step 1. Define the problem. Ryan was 29 years old, unemployed, and fully dependent on me. He had no rent history, no savings, no credit worth mentioning. His only asset was the assumption that I would never cut him off. That assumption ended now. Step 2. Define the objective. I wanted him to experience life without the cushion I had always provided. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. If he was ever going to grow into the man he was supposed to be, he had to understand what it meant to stand on his own. My objective was simple: remove myself from his safety net. Cleanly, legally, and permanently. Step 3. Identify constraints. I couldn't force him out physically, not without a legal mess that would only make me the villain in his version of events. I couldn't scream or argue either. That would give him the drama he craved, something to twist into sympathy from his friends. No, it had to be undeniable, unspinnable. He needed to face the consequences as his own doing, not mine. Step 4. Leverage timing. And here was the gift I hadn't expected: 14 days. Ryan would sit in county jail for 2 full weeks, out of reach, unable to interfere. 14 days of a completely vacant house. 14 days to dismantle the life he took for granted, piece by piece. I leaned back in the chair, the pen tapping against the paper. For the first time in years, I felt the strange relief of momentum, like a gear finally catching after slipping for too long. I went upstairs and pulled a thin file from my desk. Inside were the deeds, the insurance policies, the bank statements, utility bills, all proof of the house and everything tied to it. Everything Ryan assumed would always be his. I laid them out neatly on the bed, arranging them like puzzle pieces that were about to be taken apart. My eyes lingered on the watch box. My father's words whispered again. A man's time is the only thing he can't buy back. I had wasted enough time trying to buy my son's love with comfort. Now it was time to buy back my own life. Downstairs the clock ticked past 8. The silence felt different today, less oppressive, more liberating. I could hear myself think without Ryan's footsteps overhead, without the slam of doors, without the blaring of a TV at 10 in the morning. I picked up the phone and began making a list of calls. First, I needed a real estate agent, someone efficient, discreet, and fast. Then I needed to start sorting what to keep and what to let go. If it couldn't fit in my car, it wasn't coming with me. By the time the sun rose high enough to spill through the blinds, I had a list written clean across the page. 1. Contact agent. 2. Set timeline less than 2 weeks. 3. Pack essentials only. 4. Leave no forwarding address. It was the kind of list that didn't just plan logistics, it declared intent. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table staring at the cooling roast, the untouched plates, the cake still mocking me under its plastic dome. For years I had built a home for my son. For years I had carried him. Now I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. The best gift I could give him was to disappear. And I was finally ready to wrap it up. By mid-morning the next day, I had already made up my mind. There was no more wavering, no more asking myself if this was the right thing to do. Ryan had made his feelings clear, and for once I had the rare gift of time and silence, 2 weeks of it. I intended to use every minute. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the glow of the screen casting pale light across the dark wood. A steaming mug of coffee sat beside me, half forgotten, as I scrolled through listings for local real estate agents. My criteria were simple. Someone efficient, professional, discreet. I wasn't looking for hand-holding or small talk. I wanted results. One photo caught my eye, Anna Johnson. Sharp suit, sharper smile. Dozens of 5-star reviews. Clients described her with the kinds of words I respected: most efficient, no-nonsense, discreet, results-driven. That was all I needed. I dialed the number, and she answered on the second ring. Anna Johnson speaking. "Ms. Johnson, my name is Thomas Miller. I'm looking to sell my home." Quickly. Her tone shifted instantly, professional warmth layered with curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Miller. May I ask how quickly within a week?" A short pause. Then, "That's ambitious, but not impossible. Tell me about the property." I gave her the basics: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, updated kitchen, hardwood floors, detached garage, well-maintained, paid off completely. "May I ask?" she said carefully. "Your motivation for selling so urgently?" I hesitated, then gave the shortest version possible. "Life change. Time to move on." She didn't press. Instead, she said, "I can come by this afternoon to take a look. If the condition is as you say, we'll list immediately." "Good," I replied. "The sooner the better." After we hung up, I closed the laptop and stood. The decision felt clean, almost surgical. I pulled 3 suitcases from the closet upstairs, laying them open on the bed. I moved through the house like a man on a mission. The rules were simple. If it couldn't fit in my car, it wasn't coming. Essentials only. Clothes folded neatly, personal papers into a briefcase, a small lockbox for my tools, a few photo albums, the ones with Ryan's baby pictures, his mother's smile, our vacations before things fell apart. Those weren't just things. They were proof of a life lived. Everything else could go. The rest of the morning passed in methodical silence, interrupted only by the sound of zippers, drawers, opening items being sorted into stay or go. The watch sat on the dresser, untouched, waiting. I saved it for last. By the time Anna arrived that afternoon, the master bedroom looked like someone preparing for a long trip, which, in a way, was exactly what I was doing. She stepped inside with her phone out, snapping photos as she moved from room to room. "This will show beautifully," she said in the kitchen, running a hand across the granite countertop. "You've clearly taken care of it." "I have," I said quietly. "But it's time for someone else to enjoy it." She gave me the market rundown, flipping through numbers and comparables with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "If we list at $845,000, we'll attract strong interest. Cash buyers are moving quickly right now. I'll make it $850,000, I said. "And if we close in 7 days, I'll add $5,000 to your commission." Her eyebrows lifted, then she nodded once. "Consider me motivated." We signed the paperwork right there at the dining table, the same table I had set just the night before, for a dinner that never happened. That night, I stood at the upstairs window, looking out over the neighborhood, as the last light drained from the sky. Across the street, my neighbor Peter Collins was bringing in his recycling bins, steady and quiet as always. For nearly 20 years, we'd lived side by side, exchanging small favors without ever prying into each other's lives. I knew he'd keep an eye on the place if I asked, and that mattered more than I could say. But soon, it wouldn't be my place anymore. The decision was made. The process was in motion. The house that had been the center of my life. The house where Ryan grew up, where birthdays and Christmases and countless small moments had unfolded, would soon belong to someone else. And that, I realized, was exactly the point. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, slicing the bedroom into pale stripes. I rolled out of bed before the alarm rang my body, already tuned to a new rhythm, one not built around waiting for Ryan's footsteps or complaints. The house was still hushed in a way that felt almost reverent, like it knew it was nearing the end of its time with me. I went straight to the open suitcases on the bed. Yesterday, I'd started packing in bursts, sorting through drawers, pulling out what I thought I couldn't part with. Now I approached it differently, not sentimentally, but surgically. The rules were simple. If I couldn't carry it myself in one trip, I didn't need it. Into the first suitcase went clothes jeans I'd worn down to threads at the knees, the collared shirts I reserved for church, the soft flannel my late wife used to steal from me on cold mornings. Each piece folded neatly, not because I was trying to preserve them, but because order felt like discipline. The second suitcase took my essentials. A leather-bound notebook filled with sketches and calculations from my engineering days. The small set of tools I trusted more than any other's hammer, pliers, socket set, all of them worn smooth with use. A photo album with only the most essential pictures, Ryan's first birthday, my wedding day, my father smiling at a fishing dock. Not hundreds of photos, just enough to remind me of the life I'd lived. The third suitcase was lighter. Papers, mostly bank statements, my will insurance policies, and the thin folder that contained the house deed and tax records. It struck me that the entire weight of my life, decades of responsibility, sacrifice, and labor, could be reduced to the weight of paper stacked in a single bag. On the dresser sat the velvet box. I hesitated before opening it, but finally I lifted the lid. The watch gleamed in the morning light, its smooth face unmarked by time, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. I cradled it in my palm, hearing my father's voice again. "A man's time is the only thing he can't buy back." I slipped the box gently into the suitcase with the papers. That one I decided would never be left behind. The rest of the house, however, was another story. I moved methodically from room to room, stripping away the layers of my life like skin I no longer needed. The bookshelves in the living room, half read, half forgotten, stayed behind. The recliner that had molded to my body over years of late-night news shows, I left it where it sat. The china my wife had loved went carefully back into the cabinet, not because I didn't value it, but because I wanted the new family to feel the joy of discovering it. The kitchen was the hardest. Every drawer seemed to carry memories, the measuring cups I'd used to bake Ryan's birthday cakes when he was small, the cracked mixing bowl from Sunday pancake mornings, the cast-iron skillet that had cooked more meals than I could count. But I forced myself to be ruthless. None of it was coming. A skillet might fry an egg, but it couldn't fix a life. By noon, the house was beginning to look less like a home and more like a model property, staged and sterile. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt right. Clean. I took a break and stood at the back door looking out at the deck where Ryan had held court just 2 nights before. The boards were still stained with beer cigarette butts mashed into the gaps. For years I had built this house to give my son stability, a foundation he could always count on. But foundations mean nothing when the person standing on them refuses to build upward. I thought about the way he had looked at me when the police led him away, the sneer twisting into something fragile, almost scared. And for the first time I didn't feel guilt. I felt certainty. This was the right path. When evening came, I carried the first 2 suitcases downstairs and lined them neatly by the front door. The third I left upstairs, zipped, but open enough to remind me of what was inside my father's watch, my records, my proof that I wasn't disappearing without intention. The house hummed around me, empty but alive. Each step I took echoed just a little louder, each room a little barer. By nightfall, I realized something profound. I wasn't just packing to leave a house. I was packing to reclaim myself. The next morning, Anna called just after 9. Her voice was brisk, businesslike, but I could hear the edge of excitement in it. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I have an offer already." Cash buyer. They saw the listing last night and want to move quickly. How quickly, I asked, pen poised over the notepad at the kitchen table. Closing in 7 days provided inspection clears, which I'm confident it will. They're a young family, the Rodriguezes. Husband works in IT, wife is a teacher. 2 kids under 6. They're eager to settle before the school year begins. I looked around the kitchen, now stripped of much of its personality. Boxes stacked neatly in the corner. Cupboards half empty. The roast pan cleaned and put away the table bare. The idea of a new family filling this space of children's laughter echoing in the hallways settled into me with a strange kind of peace. "What's the offer?" $850,000 full cash, Anna said. "They'll waive appraisal if you accept today." The pen in my hand tapped once against the pad. That was the exact number I had pushed for. Exact. And the timeline aligned almost perfectly with Ryan's release. "I didn't need to think long. I'll take it." Anna's voice brightened. "Excellent. I'll email the paperwork immediately. We'll schedule inspection for tomorrow, closing by Friday. Congratulations, Mr. Miller, you've just sold your home." The call ended, and I sat there for a long moment, staring at the silent phone. Sold. The word felt final, clean, liberating. I pushed back from the table and walked through the house slowly, deliberately, as though memorizing it one last time. The living room with its scuffed floors from Ryan dragging furniture during his teenage years. The stair railing my wife and I had painted together on a rainy weekend. The upstairs hallway where Ryan had once built blanket forts that stretched from door to door. All of it was going to belong to someone else now. And instead of grief, what I felt was clarity. This wasn't a loss. It was a transfer. A family who wanted to build, to grow, to fill the rooms with love would take my place. The Rodriguezes weren't inheriting a house. They were inheriting a chance. In the afternoon, Anna came by with the paperwork. We sat again at the dining table, its surface cleared, except for the manila folder she laid down. Her pen clicked open, and she guided me through page after page, offer acceptance disclosure forms, closing timeline. I initialed where needed, signed where required, and by the time the last sheet was stacked neatly atop the others, it was official. "Inspection tomorrow," she reminded me as she gathered the papers. "But honestly, this place is immaculate. I don't expect issues." When she left, I stood at the window, watching her car pull away, the taillights disappearing down the street. The house was mine for only a handful of days more. The timeline couldn't have been sharper if I'd engineered it. Ryan would walk out of county jail the same day the Rodriguezes moved in. He would come home to a place that wasn't his anymore, to doors that wouldn't open for him, to a reality he couldn't bend with anger or charm. That thought might have stung once. Tonight it felt like justice, not revenge, but the natural consequence of choices. I carried the third suitcase downstairs and set it beside the others. 3 suitcases, 3 decades. That was all I needed. Later that evening, I stepped onto the back deck one last time. The boards creaked under my weight, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass and distant charcoal smoke from another neighbor's barbecue. I imagined the Rodriguezes out here, their kids chasing each other with sparklers on summer nights, the laughter rising instead of cutting. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. This wasn't the end. It was the handoff. And when Ryan came back, he would have to learn what it felt like to stand outside looking in and realize that a life built on someone else's sacrifice had finally closed its doors. The gift he had asked for my disappearance was almost ready, wrapped tighter than he could ever expect. The night after signing the acceptance papers, I sat at the dining table with a blank sheet of stationery in front of me. The overhead light hummed faintly, casting a pale circle onto the paper. 3 suitcases rested by the door, zipped and waiting. The rest of the house was a shell, now rooms stripped bare walls echoing with a hollow that once held our lives. I stared at the sheet pen balanced between my fingers. What do you write to a son who asked you to disappear? What words could land where years of sacrifice and love had never taken root? The answer I realized was not many. I wrote slowly, deliberately, each word measured like a stone placed in a foundation. Ryan, you wanted me gone. You wanted me. I'm giving you your wish. This house is no longer yours to take for granted. It belongs to a family who will fill it with the love and respect it deserves. I've left nothing here for you except time to think. What you do with that time is up to you. I hope one day you'll understand why I made this choice. Dad, I read it over once. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't long. But it was honest. And honesty was the only gift I had left to give him. I folded the note in thirds, slid it into a plain white envelope, and sealed it shut. On the front, I wrote his name in block letters. No return address, no explanations. Just Ryan. The next morning, when Anna stopped by with a few final documents, I handed her the envelope. The buyers are coming by for a walkthrough tomorrow, she said. Do you want to be here? No, I answered. But I'd like to ask a favor. I held up the envelope. When the Rodriguezes move in, please give this to them. Tell them to leave it on the mantel for my son. He'll be by. She looked at me carefully, searching for the right response. But instead of asking questions, she just nodded and slipped the envelope into her folder. I'll make sure it's done. That night, I walked the house one last time. The bedrooms were stripped down to carpet and bare walls. The kitchen counters were cleared. Even the scent of roast had faded from the air. Only faint marks remained indentations where the couch once sat a pale square on the wall, where a photo frame had shielded the paint from fading. I paused in Ryan's old room. The posters were gone. The shelves empty. Just a hollow space that echoed with memories his laughter, as a boy building Legos on the floor, his anger as a teenager slamming the door, the quiet moments when I'd check on him sleeping after a long day. All of it existed now only in me. I pulled the door shut, gently. Downstairs, I placed the note's duplicate copy, the one I had written for myself, into the suitcase with the watch. I didn't need to keep it, but I wanted a reminder. A reminder that I had drawn a line, that I had chosen clarity over chaos. The house groaned in the evening cool, as if exhaling, relieved to be free of the weight it had carried. I locked the front door, slipped the key into my pocket, and sat on the porch for a long while. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing warm across the street. Soon, the Rodriguezes would take their first walk through these rooms, their children running down the hallway, their voices filling the spaces that had been emptied of mine. And Ryan, he would walk up those steps expecting the life he always knew, and instead find an envelope with his name on it, holding the truth he never thought I had the strength to deliver. I rose from the porch, my suitcases lined neatly by the door, and felt something in me finally shift. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even grief. It was release. Peter Collins opened the side door before I could even knock. He was a quiet man by nature, the kind of neighbor who waved from across the yard, but never pried who shoveled your walkway in winter without leaving a note. Tonight he simply looked at the 3 suitcases lined neatly behind me and gave a single nod. "Guest room's ready," he said. I followed him inside the familiarity of his home, both comforting and strange. I'd been here dozens of times for barbecues or to watch a game, but never as a guest staying overnight. He led me upstairs to a small, tidy room with a single bed, a lamp, and a dresser. Nothing extravagant, but it felt like a sanctuary. "You can stay as long as you need," Peter said. No questions asked. "Thank you," I murmured. Those words carried more weight than I expected. When he left me alone, I placed my suitcases by the wall and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was modest, quiet, and most importantly, not mine. That was exactly what I needed. A place that carried no history, no memories, no expectations. The next morning I woke to the faint sound of children laughing. At first I thought I had dreamed it, but when I looked out the window I saw the Rodriguez family in my old yard. Mr. Rodriguez was unloading boxes from a moving truck, his sleeves rolled up, his movements steady and practiced. Mrs. Rodriguez stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, directing where things should go. Their 2 children ran across the lawn, chasing each other through the grass, as if they'd lived there all their lives. I watched quietly from Peter's upstairs window hidden behind the curtain. The sight was surreal. Just days ago, Ryan had stood in that same yard, beer in hand, sneering at me while his friends laughed. Now the air was filled with the innocent shrieks of children and the steady rhythm of a family settling into a home they intended to nurture. I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't envy, it wasn't regret, it was relief. The house was no longer burdened by anger and entitlement. It had been given to people who would treat it the way I had always hoped my son would, with care, with respect, with gratitude. That afternoon, Peter and I sat on his porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He glanced across the street at the moving truck, and then at me. "They seem like good people." "They are," I said softly. "The house will be better for them." Peter didn't push for details. He never did. He just sipped his coffee and let the silence rest between us, a silence that felt shared instead of heavy. As the sun dipped low, I returned to the window of the guest room. The Rodriguezes had set a table out on the deck, dinner plates clattering faintly through the evening air. The children's laughter drifted across the street, pure and unburdened. And then in the same frame of memory, I saw Ryan pounding on the door, demanding entry, his voice filled with anger. 2 scenes overlapped in my mind, the joy of a family claiming their home, and the chaos of a son who had never learned what a home truly meant. It struck me then that Ryan would soon be released. He would come back expecting the same house, the same arrangement, the same life waiting for him like it always had. Instead, he would find strangers in his place, a note on the mantel, and the realization that the world had shifted without his consent. The thought should have filled me with guilt. But it didn't. It filled me with certainty. I had given him almost 30 years of shelter guidance and second chances. Now I was giving him the only thing left that might finally teach him what he needed to learn the absence of me. That night, lying in Peter's guest room, I slept deeply for the first time in years. The house across the street was alive again, but it was no longer mine to keep alive. That weight was gone, and for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to breathe without waiting for the next demand, the next crisis, the next apology I'd never get. The house had a new family, and I at last had a new beginning. From Peter's window, with the Rodriguezes laughing at their new table under the porch light, the night of the arrest replayed in my head in a cleaner line than it had felt while I lived it. Memory has a way of sanding rough edges. Mine didn't. It came back with every splinter intact. After the officers first cleared the yard, the house felt like it had inhaled, and then held its breath long, thin, and aching. I walked a slow circuit, turning off the music, clicking off lights in a pattern my hands knew without thinking, kitchen, hallway, porch. The roast pan was cold. The cake dome wore a skim of condensation like a failed promise. I set a glass of water on the counter and didn't drink it. The first sound wasn't a knock. It was the side gate rattle, a cheap metal stutter I'd heard 1,000 times in wind and never once in anger. Then the flat thud of a shoulder against the fence. Then knuckles on aluminum siding, a kind of drumming that wanted to summon an audience back to a stage that had emptied. I stood in the hallway and waited 3 beats. Not because I needed time to decide, but because pauses are part of drawing a line. When I cracked the door an inch, the chain resting in its track, I could smell the beer evaporating off his breath into the cool night. His cheeks were blotched with heat. His eyes had traded smooth confidence for a frantic shine. "This is home," he said, shoulder-braced and shoved. The deadbolt translated all that force into my forearm. Pain traveled cleanly through bone to understanding. "Not tonight," I told him. I didn't pitch my voice to father or to son. I used the tone you use with a stuck hinge practical patient, unwilling to pretend metal will do what it won't. He tried swagger again, a tired jacket draped over a thinner frame. "Call them," he said, almost daring, almost pleading. "Call your buddies. Let them cuff the birthday boy." "I don't need sympathy," I said. "I need sleep." It was a ridiculous sentence on its surface and exactly the truth underneath. Boundaries are just truths kept simple. He hit the door once more, less force, more noise. Somewhere the rusted lantern his mother had found at a summer market skittered and cracked against the step. The sound cut sharper than anything he'd said. "A whole life can be measured by what makes you flinch." "Walk away, Ryan." I used his name as a full stop. For a second he did 2 steps off the porch to pace a tight oval in the grass. Fists opened and closed like he didn't know which shape to put his hands in. He came back and pounded a new rhythm on the siding. The house didn't answer. Neither did I. I dialed with the calm of a man who has decided a thing once and refuses to decide it again. The dispatcher's questions came in the flat order of policy location relationship, attempted entry, current threat. I told her what mattered and didn't embroider it. "Not unsafe," I said when she asked. "Just tired." A pause on her end, a small human acknowledgement that the word carried more weight than it looked. "Unit is en route," she said. I turned off the foyer light and stood where I could watch without being seen. He paced, worked his jaw, scrubbed his hands through his hair, stared at the street as if a sponsor might appear. Old habits look like rescue long after they're just theater. The cruisers slid into view with that strange grace police cars have heavy machines moving as if on quiet casters. Red and blue washed over the hydrangeas my wife had planted. The yard glowed like a stage under bad nightclub lights. Officer Grant stepped out first, posture easy voice, measured to reach without escalating. "Evening," he said. That word so ordinary made the whole scene more stark. He lifted a palm toward Ryan the way you do for a dog you'd rather not spook. "Let's talk." "What is this?" Ryan demanded. Not a question. An accusation looking for a hook. "He's kicking me out of my house, on my birthday." "It's not your house," I said, and even I heard how plain it sounded, like reading an address off a misdelivered package. Grant split his attention the way people learn to when they've done this more than they've slept. "To me, do you want him off the property?" "To him, your father's asking you to leave." "I live here," Ryan said, arms out, trying to stretch the facts to fit the feeling. "I have rights. You had permission," I said. "I'm withdrawing it for tonight." Grant nodded a small confirmation that the boundary I'd drawn had a name in his book, too. "That's reasonable," he told Ryan. "If you refuse, you'll be trespassing." For a second, I could see the forked path in my son's face. One way held a grudging retreat and a slammed metaphorical door. The other held a dare. He chose the dare because dare had always been the coin he spent when he ran out of sense. "Arrest me," he said, and tried to smirk. It wobbled. The cuff click was soft, efficient, inevitable. Physics had entered the chat. There was never going to be a debate with it. Grant guided his wrist, turned him in a practiced angle, said the charge in a tone so even it almost sounded like weather. Trespass. Failure to comply. 2 phrases that could have been avoided with a single step backward. He threw words over his shoulder at me. "You win, but they slid off the surface of something I'd smoothed for this exact moment. "It isn't a win," I said, hands at my sides. "It's a boundary. I meant it." He didn't have to believe me for it to be true. Neighbors glowed behind curtains and porch glass. You can feel community in the dip in a cul-de-sac's noise when something non-routine is happening. None of them opened doors. Good neighborhoods know when opening a door is help, and when it's gasoline. Grant placed a hand on the back of Ryan's head as he helped him into the back seat, a small human mercy inside a mechanical act. The door thudded shut. The lights rolled once more across my porch, and then the cars turned the corner, and the color bled off the siding like a tide. I stood on the step with the broken lantern at my feet. I picked it up and set it on the side table even though it couldn't be saved. Respect is a habit. You don't drop it because an object stops earning it. Inside, I turned on the kitchen light. The house made those tiny sounds houses make when they're finally allowed to rest, the sigh of a vent. A single pipe tick the hum of the fridge filling the gaps. I poured new water, sat at the table, and this time, drank. It wasn't triumph that settled in. Triumph needs an opponent. What landed was something colder and cleaner, like a metal plane running true across wood after too many passes with a dull blade. My hands didn't shake. I traced the grain in the table with one finger, the path worn by plates and elbows and homework. The phone face down buzzed once then again, but I didn't flip it over. I wasn't playing any more scenes tonight. I rinsed the glass, hung the towel straight on its hook, and walked the house a second time. Front deadbolt slider latched porch light off. I didn't look for ghosts of laughter or stomped footsteps. There are nights you accept the inventory as it is quiet, empty yours. At the base of the stairs, I paused and listened for what I couldn't have said. Maybe for the soft, high-syllable dad from a small boy with wet hair that used to come in the dark long before he learned all the other ways to stop needing you. Memory arrived and left like a breeze. I didn't chase it. I went upstairs. In the bedroom, the watch on the dresser caught the hallway light and returned it the way it always had, calm, indifferent to context, just doing the single job it was made to do. I set it in its box, lowered the lid, and felt how final, small motions can be. I slept in strips a few minutes, on a few off, like a guard dog, whose territory has finally been fenced and who hasn't gotten the memo he can lie down. When morning came, it didn't roll in with revelation. It simply appeared the blinds painting their usual bars on the carpet. Coffee tasted like beginning again, because beginnings don't arrive with trumpets. They hide in routines executed on purpose. If you'd asked me standing on that porch with red and blue on my face whether I was a father or a homeowner, I would have told you I had learned how to be both at once. The difference is that the homeowner has rules printed in a manual anyone can read. The father has to write his own, and then decide whether he's brave enough to enforce them. That night, I enforced them. Not loudly, not cruelly, just exactly as far as the hinge would swing. When I looked out across Peter's yard now and saw the Rodriguezes clink 2 glasses over a table they intended to use, I understood the shape of what shifted in me. I hadn't thrown my son away. I had put my name back on something that had carried it all along my time, my ground, my say. The house exhaled then. Or maybe I did. Either way, the air felt honest. And honest air is a harder-earned gift than quiet. The morning after Ryan's arrest, I woke to an emptiness that wasn't frightening anymore. It was clarifying. Sunlight crept through the blinds in Peter's guest room, painting thin gold bars across the wall. For the first time in years, there were no footsteps overhead, no door slamming, no television rattling through the walls before noon. Just silence, steady and absolute. I made coffee in Peter's kitchen, the quiet hum of the drip machine filling the air. He had left for work early, his usual routine, leaving me alone in his house. Across the street, the Rodriguez's moving truck was gone, replaced by 2 sedans parked neatly in the driveway. Their curtains were drawn back boxes stacked in the front room. Even from this distance, I could sense the kind of energy they carried, purposeful, forward-looking. It contrasted sharply with the life I had just dismantled. After breakfast, I pulled my thin file folder from the suitcase. Inside were all the documents that proved without question that the house was mine deed, insurance, taxes, mortgage payoff confirmation. I had been thorough, maybe even obsessive, keeping every piece of paper that mattered. Now I spread them across Peter's dining table, arranging them in order as though preparing for inspection. But what I was really doing was cutting ties. I called the utility companies one by one: gas, electric, water. Each time I repeated the same words: terminate service at the end of the week. New owners will establish their own accounts. The voices on the other end were polite, perfunctory tapping keys confirming dates. To them, I was just another homeowner moving on. But to me, every cancellation felt like a thread being snipped from the web that had bound me to Ryan for far too long. Then I called the phone carrier. Ryan's number was still on my plan, a cost I had justified for years. Emergencies, I'd told myself. What if he needed me? But every emergency had turned into another handout, another bailout. The woman on the line asked gently, "Do you want to transfer the number to his own account, or cancel it completely?" I pictured Ryan in jail, pacing his cell, no phone in his hand for once, forced to sit with his own thoughts. "Cancel it," I said. When the confirmation email arrived, I leaned back in the chair and exhaled. The weight of that single decision pressed against me more than the utilities had. It wasn't just about money. It was about refusing to underwrite his chaos any longer. The last call was to the bank. Ryan's name had been linked to one of my accounts for years, a joint checking we'd opened back when he was starting college, meant to help him manage expenses. I had told myself I'd close it a dozen times. Somehow I never had. The banker asked security questions, clicked through her system, and then said calmly, "All joint access has been removed. The account is now in your name only." I stared at the ceiling, the phone still warm in my hand. 3 steps, utilities phone bank, and suddenly the cords tying us together were fewer, thinner, weaker. That afternoon I drove to the county jail. I didn't go inside. I just sat in the parking lot, watching people trickle in and out, family members with worried faces, lawyers carrying files, a young woman clutching a toddler who pointed at the brick building and asked something I couldn't hear. I thought about going in, thought about visiting Ryan, but stopped myself. What would I say? What could I offer that I hadn't already given for nearly 3 decades? Another lecture, another bailout. No. That was exactly what I was trying to end. Instead, I watched the clock on the dash tick past the hour. 14 days, they had told me. 2 weeks of county time. Just long enough for me to finish what I had started. I turned the key, pulled out of the lot, and drove back to Peter's. That night, as the Rodriguezes carried the last of their boxes inside, I sat at the window with the watch in my hand. Its ticking was steady, indifferent, unbothered by my decisions. A machine doing its only job, marking time. And I realized that was all I was doing too, marking time until my son came home to a world he no longer recognized. The first call came on the 3rd night. I was sitting at Peter's kitchen table, a plate of reheated leftovers in front of me when the phone rang. Not my cell. Peter's landline, the one he kept for emergencies. He glanced at the caller ID, then slid the receiver toward me with a quiet nod. "Collect call from the county jail," a recorded voice announced. "Do you accept the charges?" For a moment I hesitated. My first instinct was to let the line die, to let Ryan sit in the silence he had created. But then I pressed 1 to accept. There was a clatter, muffled voices in the background, and then his voice, sharp, panicked, but still carrying that old edge of arrogance. "Dad, finally. What the hell are you doing?" Do you know what it's like in here? I closed my eyes, breathing once through my nose before answering. Yes, Ryan. I know exactly what it's like. 14 days, I was told. You think this is funny? His voice cracked high with outrage. I'm in here with junkies and losers. I don't belong here. You've got to get me out. I kept my tone flat. You do belong there, Ryan. At least for now. You made choices. This is the consequence. Consequence. He nearly spat the word. For what? For having a birthday party, for having friends. You called the cops on your own son. Who does that? The man whose son told him the best gift he could give was to disappear, I said quietly. There was a pause filled with voices in the background and the clang of a door shutting somewhere on his end. He didn't expect me to repeat his words back to him. That's not what I meant, he said finally, softer, but then his anger flared again. You're twisting everything. You've been breathing down my neck for years, college jobs, bills. You never let me live. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the watch ticking on the table beside me. Ryan, I didn't stop you from living. I kept you alive. Fed you, clothed you, housed you. Even now your anger comes from me not paying for your mistakes anymore. Because you're supposed to, he snapped. That's what parents do. I shook my head, though he couldn't see me. That's what children believe. Grown men understand different. He fell silent. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't mine. It was his. I let it hang before I spoke again. I'm not bailing you out. You'll serve the 14 days. When you get out, the house won't be yours. I won't be yours, not in the way you've been using me. His voice returned sharp with disbelief. You can't be serious. I am, I said simply. You're abandoning me. No, I corrected. I'm stepping back so you can stop abandoning yourself. Another silence, this one heavier, angrier. I imagined him gripping the phone tightly, jaw-clenched eyes darting around the concrete walls of his cell. You'll regret this, he hissed finally. When I get out, you'll regret it. The line clicked. The call ended. I set the receiver down gently. My hands didn't shake. My pulse stayed steady. I looked at Peter, who had been sitting quietly across the table the whole time, pretending to read the paper but listening closely. You all right? He asked. Yes, I said. For the first time in a long while, I am. That night, lying in the guest bed, I thought about Ryan's words, his threats, his anger, his disbelief. And I realized something important. It wasn't cruelty to let him face his consequences. It was mercy. A hard mercy, maybe, but mercy all the same. I had carried him for almost 30 years. Now it was time to let him walk, even if the first steps were through the hardest ground he'd ever known. Closing day didn't feel like a ceremony. It felt like a checklist executed cleanly. Anna texted me the address to the title office, a low brick building with tired carpet and fresh pens. I signed where yellow flags told me to initialed where the paralegal tapped her nail and slid documents back across a table that had hosted 1,000 other endings disguised as beginnings. Miguel and Sofia arrived with their 2 kids in tow, quiet, wide-eyed, clutching juice pouches as if passports. Miguel's handshake was firm, without trying to prove anything. Sofia thanked me for how well the place had been kept, her voice steady, with the kind of gratitude that doesn't require performance. I liked them immediately, which made the transaction easier and heavier at the same time. You'll have keys by noon, Anna said, stacking the papers in a practiced fan. Recording this afternoon. Possession upon confirmation. It was a sentence I could have drafted myself. Precise. Bounded. The kind of language that keeps chaos from entering through the edge of a clause. Before you go, I told Sofia, pulling the envelope from my jacket pocket, I have a favor. Her eyes went to the block letters, Ryan. If he shows up, he will please give him this. She didn't ask what was inside. She simply opened her purse, slid the envelope in, and closed the clasp with a soft click. "We'll make sure he gets it," she said. There was no pity in her tone and no curiosity, just a clean willingness to help. Outside, the kids tried to leap from one parking lot stripe to the next, measuring themselves against paint and distance. I watched them for a heartbeat, the way small bodies turn simple geometry into joy, then thanked Miguel and walked to my car. 3 suitcases waited in the trunk. My life fit badly in their zippers and perfectly in their purpose. By the time I reached Peter's, the email had arrived. Recording confirmed. Funds received. Congratulations on your sale. I stared at the screen until the words separated into useful parts, confirmed received sale, and then set the phone face down. The house across the street wasn't my house anymore. The sentence landed without pain. It was like hearing a diagnosis you'd already accepted and planned for. In the late afternoon, a moving van backed into the Rodriguez's drive. From Peter's upstairs window, I watched a choreography I knew by heart, a dolly squeaking across plywood boxes, labeled in the honest handwriting of people who intend to live where they put things. Kitchen, books, winter coats. There's a reverence in good labels. They say this goes somewhere you will be able to find again. I didn't text Anna to ask if the keys had transferred. I didn't need to. I could see the transfer every time Miguel carried a box through the door that used to sigh a certain way on damp mornings. The door would learn a new family's seasons now. That thought surprisingly warmed me. Peter knocked once and leaned into the doorway. "Laundry's free," he said, nodding toward the hall. And offered normal. The kind of sentence that helps a man stay in the lane he's chosen. We ate at his kitchen counter soup and bread, the kind of meal that has nothing to prove and didn't talk about the jail or the sale. We talked about Rosemary and whether the strip along his walkway could survive another summer. We talked about the way our street funnels wind on certain nights. Ordinary talk is a balm when your life has been running too hot. I slept better than I had any right to. Morning arrived like a well-behaved guest, on time and quiet. My phone face up on the nightstand showed 8:37. Ryan's release had been set for 9. I didn't dress quickly. I didn't pace. I put on a clean shirt, tied my shoes, wound my father's watch, until the small resistance said enough, and went to the window with a cup of coffee I didn't taste. At 9:02, he turned the corner. County-issued plastic bag in one hand, shoulders squared in a way that tried to pretend the last 2 weeks hadn't filed them down. He walked faster than the morning wanted him to, then slowed as the sightlines began disagreeing with memory. Same tree, same mailbox, different curtains, new car in the drive, my car nowhere. He reached the front step and did the thing your body does before your brain catches up, patted the pocket where keys had lived in another life. His hand came up empty. He tried the knob anyway. Locked. He knocked once, twice, like a man who expects his name to be the password that opens whatever he stands before. Sophia answered. She didn't open the door wide. New homeowners learn a boundary quickly. Her mouth formed a cautious hello. Miguel stepped into the frame behind her, present without being a wall. I could not hear the words from where I stood, and I didn't need to. There is a grammar to these moments. His face arranged itself into confusion, then irritation, then entitlement, then the first thin ribbon of doubt. Sophia reached into the drawer by the entry table, the place where families store things that need to be found, quickly. Pens tape the extra battery that fits nothing else. She took out the envelope. My block letters looked blunt from a distance. She held it out with the same calm she'd shown me in the title office. He didn't take it at first. He looked past her as if he might see me in the foyer I no longer crossed. Then he took it with 2 fingers like paper can burn. He said something I couldn't hear. She answered with her chin lifted a half-inch, the universal sign for "we're finished here," spoken gently. Miguel's hand rested flat against the edge of the door, not pushing, not inviting, just being where a hinge becomes a barrier. Ryan stepped back. He looked at the envelope, as if the name on the front might change if he stared hard enough. He glanced down the street left first, then right, the way people do when they're looking for witnesses rather than help. Our neighbors pretended to be busy, which is the kindness a block provides after it has already given you more attention than you deserve. He sat on the step. The plastic bag settled at his feet with a sound I felt in my teeth. He put his thumb under the flap and hesitated. For a moment I thought he would tear it in anger. He didn't. He slid his thumb a second time slower, as if the paper might show him how to proceed. From Peter's window, the distance flattened him into a shape I didn't recognize. Not the boy who slept with a glow-in-the-dark baseball on his nightstand. Not the young man who once promised me eyes bright that he'd pay me back every dime of the loan for his first car. He was simply a person outside a closed door, holding a letter that removed alibis. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. The only thing that moved in me was breath steadying into a pace I hadn't managed in years. My fingers loosened around the mug. My shoulders lowered without being told. He opened the flap. That was where I let the window curtain fall back into place. Not out of cruelty, out of respect. A man should meet certain sentences alone. My words were simple. I knew how they would land, but landing is private work. Downstairs, I rinsed my untouched coffee down the sink and set the cup upside down on the rack. Peter was at the table with his chipped mug reading the same paragraph for the 3rd time because men our age prefer text when the world is busy staging scenes. He looked up. Did he get it? He did. Peter nodded once approval without applause. Good. Across the street, the Rodriguez's door had closed again. The house had made its choice days ago. Doors are just the punctuation. I watched the blank of the wood for a beat, and then turned away. There are moments to witness and moments to let the lesson do its work without an audience. Upstairs, I opened the smallest suitcase and checked the watch, still ticking, still impartial. My father used to wind it on Sundays and say, not as philosophy, but as maintenance. Time doesn't care if you use it well. He was right. Using it well is the part you have to decide on purpose. I closed the suitcase and sat on the edge of the guest bed. The room smelled faintly of laundry soap and sawdust, the perfume of honest repair. On the nightstand, a pad of Peter's with a carpenter's logo at the top waited for anyone who needed a list. I didn't write one. The next steps had already been chosen. Outside on the step that no longer answered to my key, my son held an opened envelope, and whatever followed the sound of paper giving way. From Peter's upstairs window, I kept the curtain pinched just enough to see the steps of my old house. Ryan was still sitting there, shoulders hunched, the white envelope sagging in his hand. He had torn it open, but instead of reading it once and moving on, he kept staring at the words as though they might rearrange themselves into something kinder. The plastic jail bag rested by his feet, sagging with the weight of county-issued shoes and a bundle of papers. He shifted once, twice, rubbed his jaw, like he was trying to scrape off the silence pressing in around him. The Rodriguezes didn't come back to the door. They didn't need to. They had delivered what I'd asked, and had already returned to their dinner, their voices faintly audible through the open kitchen window. Soft Spanish phrases, children's giggles, the clink of silverware on plates. My house had already chosen its new family. Ryan lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders lifted and dropped with a sigh that looked heavier than anything he had carried in years. His arrogance, his bravado, his endless deflections, all of it seemed to drain out of him in the space of a single minute. From where I stood, he didn't look like the son who mocked me, the man who had laughed as he told his friends the best gift I could give was to vanish. He looked like a boy left out after school pickup, staring down an empty street waiting for someone who wasn't coming. For a heartbeat, the father in me wanted to go to him. To open the window, call his name, step outside, and close the distance. That reflex drilled into me over 3 decades stirred hard. But I didn't move. Because if I crossed the street now, if I gave him even a shred of rescue, I'd undo everything the last 2 weeks had been building toward. I let the curtain fall back into place. Some lessons are supposed to hurt. Downstairs, I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at Peter's table, the watch ticking faintly beside me. Each tick felt like an affirmation. Stay steady. Stay the course. Through the window, I saw Ryan finally stand. He shoved the letter back into its torn envelope and slipped it into his bag. He stood for a moment longer, glancing around the neighborhood, as though someone might step out and explain what had just happened. But no one did. The street remained still, each house politely silent. He walked off slowly, his shoulders slouched, his steps uneven. Not angry, not defiant, just emptied. As I watched him fade down the block, I felt something I hadn't felt in years release. Not triumph, not vindication, just quiet relief. For the first time since I had become a father, the weight wasn't mine to carry anymore. 3 days passed before I saw him again. I'd been living quietly in Peter's guest room, rising early, drinking coffee by the kitchen window, watching the Rodriguezes settle into their new life across the street. Their children chalked hopscotch patterns on the sidewalk, their laughter carrying through the morning air. Every box that disappeared from the moving van was like a confirmation the house had found its right owners. On the 4th morning, I was halfway through a second cup of coffee when Peter appeared in the doorway holding his phone. "He's outside," he said simply. I didn't need to ask who. When I stepped onto the porch, Ryan was waiting at the curb, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, the same jacket he'd had on the night of the arrest. He looked thinner, his jaw unshaven, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. There was no swagger now, just a hollowed-out energy like a man running on fumes. "You're hard to find," he said. His voice carried the brittle edge of someone trying to sound casual, but failing. "I wasn't hiding," I answered. "You just weren't looking in the right place." He shifted on his feet, glancing across the street at the house. The Rodriguez's curtains were open, sunlight spilling across the living room where their little girl danced with a stuffed rabbit in her arms. Ryan's gaze lingered, then flicked back to me. "So it's true," he said. "You actually sold it, sold our house. It was never yours," I corrected. Calm, even. "And yes, I sold it." He barked a humorless laugh. "Just like that. 30 years and you walk away, you throw me out like trash." I didn't flinch. "I didn't throw you out, Ryan. I stepped out myself." "There's a difference." His jaw tightened. Why now?" "You couldn't have just told me. You had to humiliate me." Police eviction, a note on the mantel. I took a slow breath, choosing each word with care. "Because you never heard me when I told you before. You only heard what you wanted. You laughed at my warnings, dismissed my help, mocked my sacrifices. So I had to do something you couldn't ignore." He shook his head, pacing a few steps. "You don't get it. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. You said them clearly," I replied. "And maybe you didn't mean every word. But you meant enough of them. More importantly, you believed there would never be a cost. You thought I'd always be here no matter what. That's what had to change." His voice cracked, then softer, almost pleading. "So what am I supposed to do now? I've got nothing. No money, no place, no one." "You've got yourself," I said. "And that's what you should have had all along." We stood in silence, the morning traffic humming faintly on the main road beyond the subdivision. Ryan's eyes darted to the Rodriguez's house again, to the porch, where Miguel had set a row of potted plants to the laughter spilling from the kitchen. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You think this is going to teach me something?" he muttered. "I hope so," I said. "But that's up to you. Not me." His shoulders slumped. For the first time, I saw something in his posture that hadn't been there before: uncertainty. Vulnerability. Finally, he said, "Buy me a coffee." It wasn't a question. More like a demand, but softer than the old Ryan would have made it. "All right," I said. "There's a diner down the road. We'll go now." We walked side by side without speaking. He stared at the pavement, and I let the silence stand. When we slid into a booth by the window, the waitress poured coffee into both cups without asking. Ryan wrapped his hands around his mug, but didn't drink. He looked at me across the table, eyes still tired, and said, "Explain it to me. Explain how a father just leaves." I met his gaze steady. "I didn't leave you, Ryan. I left the life where you lived off me without consequence. There's a difference, and you need to understand it." His fingers tightened on the cup, but he didn't argue. Not yet. For the first time, he was listening. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you've left. A jukebox in the corner flickered with colored lights, but no music played, just the low murmur of 2 truckers at the counter and the sizzle of a griddle behind the half wall. Ryan sat across from me, shoulders hunched, both hands cupped around the steaming mug. He kept staring into the dark liquid like it might give him an answer. I let the silence stretch. After years of filling every gap for him with money, with excuses, with explanations, I had finally learned the value of leaving space. He broke first. "So what now? You sold the house. You cut me off. You left me a letter like I was some stranger." What's left, I took a sip of coffee, bitter and black, and set the cup down carefully. "Choices, Ryan. That's what's left. Yours." He leaned back, scoffing, though it sounded hollow. "Choices? I don't have choices. I've got nothing. No job, no apartment, no car, just this." He gestured at the plastic bag he'd dropped beside the booth. It slumped against the vinyl like a symbol of everything he'd become. "That's not nothing," I said. "That's where you start." His laugh was sharp, humorless. "You think I'm going to climb out of this hole with pocket lint and a county jail discharge paper?" I held his gaze. "Yes. But only if you finally understand what I've been trying to teach you. You're not entitled to a rescue. You're entitled to the consequences of your choices, and from those you build." He bristled. "You sound like a drill sergeant." "No," I said evenly. "I sound like a man who's finished being your safety net." The waitress slid a plate of eggs and toast onto the table. Ryan barely glanced at it. I pushed it toward him. "Eat. You'll need it." He hesitated, then picked up a fork and shoved a bite into his mouth, chewing like he resented every movement. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Here's how this works. You have 2 paths. Tonight you can sleep in a motel. I'll pay for 1 night. Not 2. Tomorrow morning you go to the workforce center downtown. They'll set you up with applications, warehouses, construction, delivery, whatever's open. You will fill them out. You will show up. You will start proving you can hold a job." He dropped his fork with a clatter. "You're serious. Dead serious." "And if I don't?" His voice had that old edge, the defiance I knew too well. "Then you find your own way. Couch surf, sleep in a shelter. But don't come looking for me. I'm done carrying you." He stared at me, his eyes a mixture of anger and disbelief, as though he were waiting for the punchline that would never come. "You'd really let me end up on the street?" he asked. If that's where your choices take you, I answered, I'd rather see you face reality than keep living on illusions. He leaned back, exhaling hard. His gaze darted toward the window, watching cars roll by on the main road, people going to work, living lives he had never tried to build. This is insane, he muttered. You've always said family sticks together. And we do, I said. But sticking together doesn't mean subsidizing failure. It means loving enough to tell the truth. And the truth is, Ryan, you're nearly 30 years old and you've never stood on your own. That ends now. For the first time, his eyes wavered. Not angry, not mocking, just uncertain. He picked at the edge of the napkin, tearing it into strips. And if I do what you're saying, his voice was quieter now, hesitant, then you'll have my respect. Not my wallet, not my house. My respect. And you'll earn your own. He chewed on that, staring down at the torn napkin pieces scattered on the table like confetti from a failed party. Finally, he nodded once, short and sharp. One night. Motel? Then the job center. That's it, I confirmed. The waitress returned with the check. I paid in cash, leaving a tip that made her raise her eyebrows in thanks. Ryan stood slowly, stuffing the plastic bag under his arm. As we stepped outside, the sun was already beginning to dip, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. He squinted against the light, then glanced at me. You really think I can do this? I met his eyes. I know you can, but only if you finally want to. He didn't answer. Not yet. But for the first time in years, I saw him thinking. The motel key weighed heavy in his hand, a flimsy plastic card inside a cardboard sleeve with a number scrawled in blue ink, 217. I'd handed it to him at the diner's parking lot along with 2 crisp bills folded once. One night I reminded him. This buys you a bed, a shower, and a chance to think. Tomorrow you go to the workforce center. Bring proof. He didn't argue, not with words anyway. His jaw tightened, eyes flicking toward me like he wanted to spit something bitter, but the words never came. Instead, he shoved the card into his jacket pocket, pulled the plastic county-issued bag tighter under his arm, and walked away. That night I sat at Peter's table with the watch ticking softly beside me. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel compelled to follow up, to call, to drive across town, and make sure Ryan was safe. He was safe enough to finally feel the edges of his own life pressing in on him. The next morning, my phone buzzed at 9:47 a.m., a text from an unknown number at Workforce Center. Orientation starts in 10. They made me take a picture to prove it. Here. Attached was a grainy selfie. Ryan in a plastic chair, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a wall poster behind him, declaring opportunity begins here. His expression was scowling, but there he was, present, seated, accountable. I stared at the photo for a long moment, then typed back a single word. Good. Hours passed. Around 2 onso, another message came, submitted 3 apps. Warehouse delivery, janitorial. They gave me a stamped paper as proof. The photo showed a wrinkled sheet with 3 company logos, each box checked and initialed by a caseworker. For once it wasn't me signing for him. It was him. That night he called instead of texting. His voice was flat, almost resentful. This is humiliating. Sitting in a room with people who've been unemployed for months, listening to some counselor talk about resumes and interviews like we're in kindergarten. Humiliating or humbling? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he muttered, maybe both. That's good, I said. Humility's where you start. Silence stretched on the line, heavy but not hostile. I'll let you know if I hear back from any of them, he said, and then he hung up. I sat there in Peter's guest room, staring at the darkened street through the window. Across the way, the Rodriguez's house glowed warm and alive, children's laughter spilling faintly into the night. My house no longer my burden, no longer, and yet still in some way my son's future was tethered to me by a thread. But for the first time he had taken a step without me dragging him. And maybe that was enough for now. The next morning another message buzzed through. A picture of Ryan in line at a warehouse job fair, his hair damp from the rain, his expression resigned but present. You wanted proof. Here it is. I smiled, faint and tired, but real. This wasn't redemption. It wasn't transformation. It was the smallest spark of accountability. And after 30 years, even a spark looked like a fire beginning. 2 days later, he asked me to meet again. His text was brief, coffee same diner. But I could read between the lines. He wanted acknowledgement, proof that I'd seen his effort. When I arrived, he was already in the booth, a cup of coffee in front of him, steam curling up like a signal flare. He looked different, and not in ways most people would notice. His clothes were the same, his jaw still rough with stubble, but there was a weight in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Not arrogance, responsibility, or at least the first flickers of it. He pushed a folder across the table when I sat down. Inside were copies of applications, stamped sheets from the Workforce Center, a schedule for a warehouse interview. His handwriting was scrawled at the bottom of one form, uneven, but his. You wanted proof, he said, voice clipped. There it is. I closed the folder gently and looked at him. Good work. He blinked clearly, expecting more praise, relief, maybe even gratitude. But I let the words stand simple and solid. That's it? He asked. That's it, I replied. Because this isn't about me congratulating you. It's about you proving to yourself you can do it. He leaned back, arms crossed. You really mean it, don't you? You're not letting me back in. Not the house, not your money, not even your spare room. I shook my head. No, Ryan, I mean exactly what I wrote in that letter. I love you enough to stop enabling you. Love isn't endless rescue. Love is boundaries. And boundaries mean I won't house you again. Not until you can pay your way. Not until you can stand on your own. He stared at me, eyes narrowed. For a moment I thought anger would flare again, but it didn't. Instead, his arms slowly uncrossed. His fingers drummed against the coffee mug, restless but not hostile. So what then? He asked finally. What happens now? Now I said you keep doing what you started. You show up to interviews. You hold a job. You build your own ground, even if it's shaky at first. And you learn what every adult has to learn, that respect is earned, not handed out like allowance. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. And if I fall, then you get back up, without calling me to lift you. He looked down at his hands. The nails chewed the skin rough. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He just sat there staring at the evidence of his own work, the folder of papers he had carried here himself. I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Finally, he said, I found a place. Transitional housing, the counselor told me about it. It's not much, but it's a bed. Shared room curfews rules. Good, I said. Take it. You're not going to offer something better. No, because better is what you build for yourself. He let out a breath, sharp and shaky, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a boy, something that looked like acceptance. The waitress refilled our cups, smiling politely. Ryan thanked her without being prompted. A small thing, but I noticed. As we sat there in the faded booth, I realized this was the turning point. Not the sale of the house, not the arrest, not even the letter on the mantel. This moment, Ryan sitting across from me, folder of proof in front of him, shoulders lower but steadier, was where the possibility of change truly began. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it. Maybe this time you'll stand. And for the first time in years, I believed he might. The days that followed felt oddly quiet, not because Ryan had disappeared again, but because the silence wasn't heavy with avoidance anymore. It was punctuated by updates, small signals that, for once, he was doing what he said he would. The first came in a text at 6:45 one morning interview today. Warehouse job. They wanted an emergency contact. I put your number down. I stared at the message longer than I expected. My number mine wasn't a request for money or bail or a ride. It was a name written on a line he hoped no one would ever need to call. A small step, but a step toward responsibility. The next day, another text arrived, this one with a picture attached. Ryan standing outside a gray building with a faded sign that read, Midwest Distribution Center. He looked stiff in a borrowed shirt and tie, the collar a little too tight. His hair was combed in a way I hadn't seen since high school graduation. Interview done. They said they'll call if I pass background and drug test. I typed back only 2 words. Proud of you. No lecture, no conditions. Just truth. He didn't reply, but hours later another message buzzed through thanks. For Ryan, that single word carried more weight than paragraphs. Over the next week, I watched from Peter's porch as the Rodriguezes settled deeper into the house. Sophia planted marigolds along the walkway. Miguel installed a new basketball hoop above the garage. Their children's laughter drifted across the street in bursts bright and clean. Each time I looked at that house, I thought about the boy I had raised there and the man who was slowly trying to rebuild himself outside of it. For years I had mistaken shelter for love, thinking a roof and meals were enough. But now, standing at a distance, I understood that love wasn't about removing every obstacle. It was about refusing to stand between someone and their chance to grow. A week later, Ryan called, not texted, called. His voice was different, tighter, carrying an edge of nerves I recognized instantly. They offered me a probationary shift, he said. Nights, loading trucks. Pay isn't much, but it's steady. Starts tomorrow. For a moment, I let myself close my eyes, letting those words sink in. Not a bailout, not an excuse, not another demand. A job? That's good news, I told him. It's something he admitted. There was no triumph in his tone, no swagger. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this was a beginning. Remember, I said it's not about perfect. It's about consistent. Show up, every shift, every time. That's how you rebuild trust with them, with yourself. He was silent a long moment, then said softly, With you too. I swallowed the watch ticking steadily on the nightstand beside me. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day, Ryan. But yes, every step matters. He exhaled, shaky, and for the first time in a long time, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy. Hope. That night, I stood again at Peter's window, watching the Rodriguezes' porch light glow against the dark. Their children's chalk drawings still decorated the sidewalk. Crooked hopscotch squares, bright suns, names scrawled in uneven letters. Across the street, new life filled the house. And across town, in some modest shared room with curfews and rules, my son was preparing for his first real shift in years. For the first time, I felt the threads connect not of dependence, but of possibility. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was accountability. And accountability was the first solid ground Ryan had ever stood on. The rhythm of the neighborhood began to settle again, but it wasn't the rhythm I'd known for 30 years. It was steadier, warmer, more alive. The Rodriguezes filled the house across the street with movement that made the walls look younger somehow. On summer evenings, I could hear their children's laughter floating across the block, chasing one another with neon frisbees and squeals that belonged to a family unburdened by the past. From Peter's porch, I watched Miguel carry bags of soil to the backyard, the kind of man who plants roots as naturally as he breathes. Sophia hung wind chimes on the porch, their notes soft and lilting, catching the breeze in a way that reminded me of balance. They didn't just move into a house they claimed it honored, it built something new from it. The contrast was sharp against the updates I got from Ryan. He texted late at night, short messages after his shifts. Back hurts. These boxes weigh a ton. Made it through orientation. Supervisor's strict. Didn't quit today. I read those 3 words, didn't quit today, over and over. That was his version of progress. His version of survival. One evening he called instead of texting. His voice was ragged with exhaustion. I've never worked this hard in my life, he admitted. Feet are killing me. I dropped a box, thought I'd get fired right then, but the supervisor just told me to keep moving. Then keep moving, I said. That's all any of us can do. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't angry silence anymore. It was tired, real human. Across the street, Miguel's kids raced down the driveway on scooters, their mother clapping her hands to call them in for dinner. The smell of roasted peppers drifted on the evening air. I realized I wasn't watching with envy. I was watching with recognition. They were walking the same ground I had once walked, raising children, planting gardens, making something honest. Honest ground. That phrase settled in my mind like a stone in still water. Honest ground wasn't just about soil or property. It was about standing where your work matched your living, where your effort showed in the roof over your head, the food on your table, the respect in your voice. The Rodriguezes had it. Peter had it. And slowly, painfully, Ryan was beginning to find it. I thought back to the years I had carried him, paying bills, cleaning up his messes, bailing him out of trouble. That wasn't honest ground. That was quicksand. Both of us sinking me, convincing myself it was love, while it swallowed us whole. Now, for the first time, he was dragging himself onto firmer soil. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, but it was his. Later that night, as I wound my father's watch, I thought about how time measures progress differently than we do. Seconds tick in perfect order, never wavering. But human progress is jagged, stumbling, uneven. Still both keep moving forward. When Ryan texted again, still here, still working. I didn't reply with advice. I just wrote, that's what matters, because for once it was true. Across the street, wind chimes sang in the dark. Inside Peter's guest room, the watch ticked steady. And somewhere across town, my son was standing on ground he'd finally begun to earn. The cracks began to show, not in Ryan's job, surprisingly, but in the world he had once clung to. It started with a text, not from him, but from a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Miller. This is Melissa. We were at Ryan's birthday. The night you... Well, you know. I almost deleted it without reading further, but curiosity made me scroll. I just want to say I'm sorry. We shouldn't have laughed. I didn't realize how bad it was. I thought it was just him being dramatic. I haven't heard from him since, but I hope he's okay. No apology could erase that night, but the message was a reminder his old circle wasn't standing as firmly behind him anymore. They were peeling away, uncomfortable, with the fallout of a man whose foundation had finally shifted. A week later, Ryan called me, his voice thick with frustration. She left, he muttered. Melissa, I asked. Yeah. Said she can't deal with the hours, the job, the attitude adjustment. He scoffed, but there was no bite in it. Just weariness. Guess she liked me better when I had free rent and no responsibilities. I let the silence hang, not offering comfort, not offering judgment. Finally, I said, some people aren't built to stand beside you when the ground gets hard. Guess not, he muttered. But I could hear the sting. For the first time, he wasn't blaming me. He wasn't raging at the unfairness of it all. He was just facing the loss. Later that week, he showed me a string of messages from Kyle and Derek, the same friends who had laughed loudest that night. Bro, when you're done with this warehouse crap, hit us up. We'll get things rolling again." He shook his head, holding the phone out as if the words themselves were poison. They don't get it. They still think this is temporary, that I'll just go back to the old me when this blows over. "And will you?" I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I can't. Not after everything." It was the first time I believed he meant it. One evening, sitting on Peter's porch, I received another call from Ryan. His voice was quieter than usual, raw at the edges. "You know what the hardest part is?" he asked. "What I keep hearing your words, boundaries, consequences, standing on my own, and I hate it. But I know you're right. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind him how many years I'd said the same things he'd ignored. I just let the silence speak. The wind chimes from the Rodriguez's porch filling the gap. "Dad." His voice cracked. "I'm here," I said. "I don't know if I can do this forever, but I know I can do it tonight. And maybe tomorrow. That's all you need to know right now," I told him. That night, lying in Peter's guest room, I thought about the fractures spreading through Ryan's old life girlfriend, gone friends, pulling away comforts stripped. Painful? Yes, but necessary. Like bones that had to break clean before they could heal straight. For years, I had shielded him from pain, thinking it was love. But watching him now, I realized pain was the very thing teaching him what comfort never had: resilience. It wasn't easy to hear the exhaustion in his voice, to know he was walking through loneliness I couldn't shield him from. But it was necessary. And maybe the lessons were finally landing. The weeks turned into a month, and in that time I learned something I hadn't expected. Peace doesn't come in a single moment like a curtain rising on a new act. It comes slowly in layers through ordinary days. Ryan kept his job. The hours were long, the pay modest, but each time he called, his voice carried a new edge. Not arrogance, not resentment, but tired pride. "Clocked out on time," he'd say, or "didn't miss a shift." Simple words, but they mattered. The Rodriguezes had made the house fully theirs. From Peter's porch, I watched Sophia water flowers that hadn't been there a month ago, Miguel tinkering with the basketball hoop, while his son dribbled clumsy shots in the driveway. Laughter filled the air, where weeks before cruelty had echoed. And instead of pain, I felt relief. Relief that I had finally chosen honesty for myself, for my son, for the home I had once kept. One evening, Ryan and I sat in the same diner booth where we'd had our hardest talks. His shoulders were straighter now. His hands, calloused from lifting boxes, no longer trembled with restlessness. He looked across the table at me and said quietly, "I get it now. I don't like how it happened. But I get it. I didn't need an apology." That sentence was enough. Later, lying in Peter's guest room with my father's watch ticking steadily on the nightstand, I thought about the years I had spent trying to buy Ryan's respect with money, with shelter, with endless second chances. None of it worked because love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's fear. Fear of losing someone if you stop giving. But real love draws the line. It says, "I will always care for you, but I will not carry you." It teaches a man to walk even if the first steps are painful, even if he stumbles. And that was the lesson I wanted to leave with you, whoever's watching, whoever's listening. Time is the one thing you cannot buy back. Spend it wisely. Spend it on building, not enabling. Spend it on boundaries, because boundaries are the truest form of care. I gave my son nearly 30 years of comfort, and it nearly destroyed him. I gave him one moment of hard truth, and it may have saved him. If you're a parent, a friend, or even just someone holding too much weight for someone else, remember this: love doesn't mean carrying someone forever. Love means stepping aside and letting them find their own ground. So So I ask you, what ground are you standing on today? And what ground are you letting others stand on for themselves? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if you've had to draw a hard line, or if someone ever drew one for you. And if this story has resonated, if it's reminded you of the value of time boundaries, and love, hit that subscribe button. Because our stories matter. And sometimes telling them is the first step toward honest ground.